There was a time when John Dean asked me if I could set up a safe house for the president. And even at that tender age, I knew there were people like him who could set up safe houses with their eyes closed. And so I said to John, that's crazy. And John said, well, the president doesn't want them involved in this, which gave me a really fine sense that something was going to go terribly wrong.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served war zone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. In this episode, we sit down with statesman and Ambassador David Miller, who shares his expansive and storied career, starting from his early days surveying economic impacts in Vietnam during the war, to his intricate experiences with the National Security Council and various international postings and ambassadorships. We're joined, as usual, by Glenn Korn, who spent a career much like Ambassador Miller in service to the United States, but on the CIA side of the house, as opposed to the diplomatic. And you get to hear what it's like when chiefs of station and ambassadors truly work together. Ambassador Miller recounts tales of working closely with influential figures such as Nelson Mandela and Brent Scowcroft, and discusses his involvement in developing the Diplomatic Studies Foundation, which is a fascinating approach that brings war games to country teams with a different outcome in mind: peace. Ambassador Miller reflects on the challenges of delivering unvarnished intel and narrowly avoiding any involvement in what he could sense was a scandal that was coming and was later known as Watergate. It's a great story. You're going to love it. And then Ambassador Miller also helped start the Special Operations Fund, which directly supports some of America's most important families, those of the fallen Tier 1 special operators who lost their lives in combat or training, which I know people who listen to this show will deeply appreciate. With that, please enjoy this fun and wide-ranging and interesting discussion with two very storied leaders and patriots. Ambassador Miller, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and share some of your stories from your storied career.
Thank you. It's a question of how much you want that's factual and how much is storied. But let me stick to the facts, at least at the start. And of relevance, I think, to this discussion, most importantly was getting out of law school and going essentially directly to Sanut and begin to wander around the Vietnamese countryside 6 months before Tet and then 6 months after. Was with a group of Harvard and MIT professors that had been assembled by ARPA at that point without the D to offer sort of an independent intellectual assessment of what was going on.
Interesting.
When I say that, that almost sounds like humor to me, but it was a very, very good group of folks. And my thesis advisor was a macro guy, economics, and I'm a micro person, and so he was looking at the big economy, and I was trying to understand if on the ground the economy was actually working, which got us into the Hamlet evaluation system. And so looking at the HES system and reporting on economic activity was sort of my first chance to take a look at the effects of kinetic energy on components of economic development. And so that was the first one.
Yeah.
Basic question: what college sends their thesis students to Vietnam, like their semester abroad during an active war? What was that?
Harvard always expects big financial gifts. Just a shout out to my friends up in Cambridge. And since I didn't have enough money to do that, I said, I'll send the kid to Vietnam.
Okay, so the guy that with the parents that had the money, they went to like the Sorbonne, and you went to Vietnam.
Yeah.
I know you, sir.
Yeah. So there was that. I think that there are a lot of takeaways, obviously, from that situation. One is that this was some of Bob McNamara and the Ford Motor Company whiz kids and so on. And they had the ability to take garbage and accumulate it and polish it, and it looked like data. By the time it got to MacV, we had won the war last week, and all the bombing that was still going on was really wasted ordnance. And it taught me an important lesson, and that is the uniformed services as an intelligence agency, when evaluating their own actions, they're not wildly good at that. They, by instinct, follow an orderly structure. You can't get people to go over a beach if everybody stops and says, I think the tree line is too far away. I think we should go back in the water and start over again. If you ask the military to do a big study of how they're doing, it's very likely they'll be okay. So the important part of intelligence that the Army needs is tactical intelligence. And that's where civilians are uniquely not capable. If you talk to some breacher who says, I want to know the details of the door behind you, ambassadors are liable to say, it looks like it's made out of wood to me. Where any decent breacher is beginning to say, how many hinges set in what kind of concrete with how much rebar and so on. I don't want to kill the people inside, but I only get to blow the door out once. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things I took away from the Vietnam experience was the value of, in those days, the CIA trying to say, we think this is reality. And the Army saying, no, this is reality. I got exposed to that at a young intellectual age.
Which we ran into in Afghanistan again, right? I mean, there were different assessments and a lot of arguments about how well we were doing.
Yes.
And it's probably a value to have. That's why we have the communities kind of divided. So we have different points of view.
No, exactly.
So were you brought in there to kind of refute some of the polished, as you said, garbage that was going out? Was that part of the ARPA's mission at that time?
Not necessarily to refute. It was to validate lots of issues. We actually got things like KIAs. What did the other side lose during the day? Somebody wants a body count. The guy you send out to get a body count is going to get killed. You look at the rice paddy, and we said, okay, there are 30 left feet sticking up in the rice paddy. How many dead hostile people are there? We sent a message back to the White House that said, you can't do this. but we actually tried for a week.
Were you independent enough to say that? How hard was that at that age for you?
Honest to goodness, sir, that's never been that hard. I was part of that little group that briefed Governor Romney because I'd gone to Michigan Law School. But we had the opportunity to sit down with the governor and say, look, this is reality as the civilian community sees it, leading to the governor's response of his being brainwashed and so on. But no, we were just there trying to validate what happened. Then post-Tet, for example, we spent 6 months going back to hard points that we had reported on before the offensive to say, pretty good in Batri district and Quinhua province, not so good here. Out in District 10, where we pretty much lost control of District 10, you may remember, and it was obliterated. That's where I learned that tanks do not need roads. They just sort of drove where they want, and it does ruin the real estate. It just makes a mess out of things.
But to Ryan's question, like, how did the military respond if you were saying things that they didn't want to hear? Was there pushback? Subtle things like, hey, we're going to drop you off in Viet Cong territory and say, work your way back. I mean, what was the?
Well, you and your rotary assets had to get me out to countryside so I could look around, which generally speaking was a pain in the behind for them and so on. So the only pushback I got was they tried to terrorize me in the insertion effort, which it turns out, frankly, I think helicopters are a lot of fun. But they would rock back and forth over the canals with skids sort of hitting the top of the palm trees. And I think they were waiting for me to scream and jump out the door. And we got shot at and all that kind of stuff.
When you say terrorized during the insertion effort, that reminds me of my high school years. Anyway, let's move on.
Hey, Glenn, maybe a question to you. You were also on that same end of having to deliver probably less than desirable information during a war over the past 20 years in the post 9/11 war. I mean, how did you deal with that when you were about to deliver information that you thought might not be well received?
Well, I would say that, like, within the agency, I never had any pushback, honestly. The leadership was pretty good about it. Some other parts of the government didn't want to hear the story sometimes, and there would be bureaucratic battles. But I would say that generally the leadership in the agency always had our backs. Like when I was responsible for an issue and you had to deliver bad news. And I was thankful for that. I can't think of too many examples where like we were thrown under the bus. I was too junior for some of the more famous cases now, like weapons of mass destruction. And I was just an operator then, collecting and out on the street. And thankful for that as well. But when I got more senior, generally we got a lot of support. And I was never threatened not to say something. Right, the opposite. I was encouraged.
Wow, Ambassador, as you came out of that year in Vietnam, clearly you go on to a very storied career in the diplomatic service. Was there any concern there or thought to go into the military after that?
I ended up in the White House Fellows Program. And so spent essentially 3 years around the Attorney General's office, Mr. Mitchell for most of that time, and then on and off with John Dean. And then it seemed prudent to not be there. And I missed a number of years of free food up at Lewisburg.
Why was it prudent to not be there when you say that?
Well, there's some of this in the public record, but fundamentally there was a time when John Dean asked me if I could set up a safe house for the president, and even at that tender age, I knew there were people like him who could set up safe houses with their eyes closed. And so I said to John, that's crazy. And John said, well, the president doesn't want them involved in this, which gave me a really fine sense that something was going to go terribly wrong. So I ended up working in a very large corporation.
So how'd you handle that when your boss said, I want you to set up, basically do something that is illegal?
And this is Nixon, right? This is under the Nixon administration.
I mean,
dumb. Okay.
Yeah. Sort of your first consideration is that's really stupid.
Right.
You quit. I mean, there are times in your career, and it's advice I always give to younger people: always have a parachute on. If you think this town is a nice place to work, you haven't been working hard enough. Because you will come across things that will be very difficult. And you've got to be happily married to a co-conspirator who cares about the country, primarily. So I've always had the support to walk out the door and say, I can't do this responsibly.
And that ended up that was part of Watergate later on, sir.
Yeah. I went out to a very large corporation and had an opportunity to talk with the chairman there. And before Watergate, I looked at Mr. Kirby and I said, the president will not serve out his second term. And the chairman of the corporation sort of looked at me and said, what are you talking about? And I said, he will not serve out the second term. It won't work.
Yeah.
If you were there were a lot of fine people that got caught up in this, led by Bud Crow, who's one of the finest guys I've worked with in government. When it all blew up, he was convicted. He went up to Lewisburg, and then Alan Wood and I used to go up and see Bud. And when it was all over, he got his bar membership back, I think out in the state of Washington. But those were unusual times.
This is something Glenn and I had talked about before, which is just as you have these changes in administration, you get people in the military. I saw this clearly in the military and, very low level at the agency, not where you were by any means, Glenn, but just people on one side of the aisle or the other who get frustrated by whoever is the newly elected leader and can be very vocal about it. And I've had to have pointed discussions, certainly when we were downrange in the military, just we don't make the choice. I mean, we have our vote, but our job is to execute the mission. And certainly if it's something illegal, that's very different. What you just described, aside from that, it's our job to execute and do what we were brought here to do. And it's not easy. It's certainly not easy on junior officers, I will say, trying to lead from the front in that situation.
That's really how the Diplomatic Studies Foundation came about. And that is we, a bunch of old guys, were sitting around saying, we're not doing as well internationally as we should. So you can argue about strategy forever, but tactics, you can sort of look at the deployment of national assets versus the objective and say what we began to say to ourselves, we've got to be able to do tactics better. So the Diplomatic Studies Foundation sort of got together, Tom Pickering, Chet Crocker, Randy Beard, Steve Kappas, Glenn Corn.
These are all legends for people listening, if these names aren't familiar in this community.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we first did a study of the National Security Council, which has emerged as the driving engine of this activity, and testified for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And then they said, oh, you could do a study of the State Department. So we did a study of the State Department. And then through a series of conversations with DepSec John Sullivan and so on, we said, we're going to do education and training. That's the key to long-run success is competence of the officers involved in pursuing tactics. And so we have developed this little country team training game, which they go back and forth between the military and the civilian community. Wargames want to give you total battle space awareness. The civilians don't have a game like that. And so I spent 4 years in Africa on a very large project that was essentially total battle space awareness over
for the private sector.
Yeah, for the private sector. And so we did this country team training game so that civilians could learn the same thing that uniformed services do. And that is, what's the threat? What is my response capability? What don't I know? If I know everything, and hopefully, do I have a response package capable of handling that? And honest to goodness, when we called this a peace game, everybody said, oh, we must have a peace game. I mean, surely we must train embassies how to work together. And the answer was no. This is Johnny Carson McMahon trying to do a handoff here.
No, you are so correct, sir. You're all right. No, so Johnny, you're the best.
Serious.
No, the peace games and DSF, very, very unique. When Ambassador Miller, when I met him and he told me about this project, I said, Ryan, we did training with the FBI, we did training with the Special Operations Command, we did training with other elements of the U.S. government on the security side, but we never did training with State Department, right? We never did training with USAID,
which is amazing. Yeah.
Which is amazing, right? Because you're out in the field doing stuff. In the field, you're thrown together with them. When you're a junior officer, you just socializing with them at the club, or maybe in different sections. But when you're in leadership positions, for the first time you're sitting across from someone from state, someone from treasury, whatever, and you have to get along with them. And there's no program that was designed to meld people back here in a non-threatening environment, right? Yeah. And so this program that the ambassador developed and the team at DSF developed is pretty impressive because it's basically a war game designed for the outcome to be not war, not kinetic action, but peace, like success diplomacy. And it's kind of important to mention this right now because we just came out of a very, let's say, tense press conference in the White House or meeting between the Ukrainian president and the US president and vice president. And one of the things that JD Vance said is like, we want to get to peace. And I think we all want that, right? But how do you get to peace? You have to have this diplomatic skills and tactically be able to operate as a team to use all the tools that the US government has at its disposal to get victory without having to go to war. So it's a noble objective, and it's something that the peace games and the DSF has been working to help State Department and other parts of the U.S. government, the foreign affairs community, accomplish.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, Mint Mobile, and we'll get right back to this combat story. I don't know about you, but I like keeping my money where I can see it. Unfortunately, traditional big wireless carriers also seem to like keeping my money too. After years of overpaying for wireless, I finally got fed up from crazy high wireless bills, bogus fees, and free perks that actually cost more in the long run and switched to Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile is what I use for my Combat Story account. It's worked flawlessly when I'm at home and when I'm traveling. Say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. Ditch overpriced wireless and get 3 months of premium wireless service from Mint Mobile for $15 a month. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/combatstory. That's mintmobile.com/combatstory. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. And now, back to this combat story. Yeah, I love this concept. And Glenn, I might just put this question to you. We hear this term, the country team, which makes sense to those of us who have been in those communities overseas. Could you just explain to listeners, what is the country team? And then maybe, Ambassador, after Glenn explains that, how would you see something like this playing out right now with Russia and Ukraine in reality? Like, how would this work properly?
Yeah, great question. And a country team. So every embassy, every diplomatic mission abroad is run by an ambassador who is the president's special representative to the country. So country X. And then you have different agencies and departments that are represented there. They have their personnel there. So you have State Department, may have Treasury, you may have some places. We had NASA, we had the Defense Intelligence Agency. So you have defense attachés. So you go down the list. Sometimes now many more places, Homeland Security and FBI, because we're trying to bring the fight to the enemy downrange, right? Outside our borders. And the ambassador is in charge of all those people that are under the ambassador's authority. And the country team is basically like the leadership team, or maybe like the corporate board that meets usually once a week. When I was in positions of authority, tried to avoid those meetings like the plague.
That's the joke, right? Isn't it, that we wouldn't say anything in those meetings?
Yes. Well, either that or I had one ambassador tell me that he said, Glenn, you're always the grumpy guy. You always had bad news. I'm like, sorry.
You got an image to uphold.
But the country team, if you have a country team that functions well, it can be super valuable because everyone knows what the synergy is, what capabilities you have, what access you have, who you're talking to, what you can bring to bear. And if you have an experienced ambassador, they know how to make a country team gel. But of course, one of the goals of DSF is to train people to be better on country teams before they even go into the live scenario, right? And I'll turn it over to Johnny Carson. Here's Johnny.
Yes. See, we've been practicing this for an hour or two before you came on.
It's clear.
Yeah, generally speaking, that's a good description of the country team, and the fact that a good ambassador then takes that country team and does two things. And that is, if you're a good manager, you can make 2 and 2 equal 5. That's Vince Lombardi. That's all great coaches. They take people. It's the Spec Ops recruiting issue. You start off with 100 young people out at Buds, and you end up with 5. Mm-hmm. People learn how to play over their head when they're well coached. So the ambassador's doing two things. He's looking at the assets that are there and getting them to play better. And then he's the only person at post that can identify gaps and try to fill them. So if you play this peace game, you say the 95th Civil Affairs guys are like the development missions, but the 95th wears uniforms and the other aid programs don't. Oh, okay. And then if you see gaps in your authorities, you're the only guy that pick up the phone, call back to the NSC and say, I got a problem. I can't do this. And I'm not even sure I have the legal authority. So would you tell me, can I do this? And if we practice that here, before things are going wrong downrange, it's theoretically possible that we could actually do better downrange if we practiced here. Mm-hmm. So that's really what we've been up to.
Scrimmaging.
Yeah.
Right? It's scrimmaging. So for those of us that play football, American football, not that other strange football.
No.
I just alienated half your audience. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say that's like.
But you mentioned Vince Lombardi.
Zelensky.
You mentioned Vince Lombardi, the greatest American leader ever, maybe after Ronald Reagan. I don't know. Someone. And Ambassador David Miller.
Yeah,
president of the Diplomatic Studies Foundation.
Yeah, I pay him $2.50 for every inject like that.
Which, by the way, nowadays doesn't even get me a cup of coffee.
Yeah, but you got to say it more. I mean, that's how you get the.
That's right. You want coffee? Yeah.
That was $5 right there.
Oh man, I'm making a killing here.
Yeah. Let me tell you something I wanted to say about that. Just a little exchange. This is how an embassy ought to run. There's this friendship at an embassy is absolutely critical. If the COS and the ambassador don't work together, you have a huge gap. We ought to be a reinforcing team, and it's like everything else. Trust comes from getting to know each other, and laughing together. And there are going to be good days when bad things are put off, and then there are going to be bad days when bad things occur.
Right.
And you gotta like each other.
With what we're seeing with Ukraine right now, just can you give not even an example, but for both of you who have been on the front lines of dealing with pressing issues from the NSC, globally, partners, should we imagine a country team is being convened right now in Ukraine, or pick your country for this? What are they talking about in those sessions right now? Who are you mobilizing in the embassy community to try to get ahead of what's happening? And this is all in light of discussions between President Trump and Zelensky, as you alluded to earlier, Glenn.
Public affairs, for sure, because you're going to have the whole press piece. Imagine a lot of people in Ukraine have a lot of questions, and people around the world. I'm sure embassies around the world, they have to get their talking points to try and explain what the position, U.S. position is. Not your political officers going to talk to people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and maybe the presidency. The ambassador is going to be doing a lot of engagement. Maybe the ambassador is actually here with President Zelensky. In a lot of cases, that's what you do. You send with the principal.
Yep.
You're going to have. We should give a shout out to our friends in diplomatic security, because you may have increased threats to an embassy, or of course you also have to do all the security for the VIP traveling here. Everything. Defense, like the military attache's got to go talk to MOD, got to talk to the different services. So, and of course, behind the scenes, we don't know what's being discussed, but we may be making new agreements. We do have this new mineral agreement, which has been achieved. And so there's going to be, I'm sure, like Treasury is going to have to get involved. You're setting up visits. A lot of people from Congress are going to want to go out and talk to the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Ukrainian delegations are going to want to come here. So there's a lot of logistical coordination, which is very difficult. And it also often takes up, my experience overseas was it took up over half the time of an embassy. All
coordinating visits and
yeah. So there's a lot. And of course the ambassadors trying to manage all this.
It's like the chief of protocol's job. If two heads of government get together and the meeting ends at the White House, they've gotten along, everybody says, what great people they are.
Right.
And then if you have a meeting and it doesn't work, everybody looks at the chief of protocol and says, boy, that was dumb. You sat them in the wrong place. How did you do that? It is a job that never wins.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Where there's a lot of churn right now.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, I'm going to pivot just slightly in the interest of time to the Special Operations Fund, sir. So obviously you spent a year in Vietnam. You have a long-time career at the NSC as an ambassador in private sector.
Yeah.
But you took the time to stand up and support the special operations community. And I'm just curious where that came from.
Brent Scowcroft.
Interesting.
No, that's a single word answer. General Scowcroft and I became friends when we were both in the private sector. I was back from being an ambassador. He was in between tours as a national security advisor. And we'd gotten to know each other. And he got a call from the incoming president, asked him if he'd come back as a national security advisor. And we were right along in a taxi here in town. And he looked at me and he said, President-elect just phoned me and asked me to come back as a national security advisor. And I said, I hope you said yes. And he said, I think I did, to which I wanted to say, you should know the answer to that clearly. And then he said, yeah, but you're coming with me. And I said, well, that's cute. What are you thinking I should do? And he said, we'll have breakfast next week, whatever I'll tell you. At breakfast, he said, I want you to take the counterterrorism, drugs and thugs account, if you will, hostages and so on. And I said, so what do you want me to do? We cannot have another Ollie North. We cannot afford to have people pick up the phone and say, this is the White House. As Brent would say, the White House doesn't call anybody. There are people that work there that call people. And so his big question to me was, tell me what you think of these guys. I don't want to pick on anybody by name, but there are famous SEAL 6 commanders and so on who had a great deal of chutzpah, like breaking into the CNO's house and little things like that. So we didn't want to see that happen. So I got to know these guys, and they're extraordinary people. And I had a background in investing. And so when I left, I knew widows and kids and so on and so forth. And I said, well, I'll put money together to try to take care of it. It's a relatively simple idea. It's been going almost 35 years. And we cover all the tier 1 units and anybody out with a tier 1 unit.
Amazing. Yeah.
It's been the most wonderful thing I've done in my life.
Wow.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that, sir. I mean, we have many people on here from those communities on this show. We don't often talk to the family members, but almost to a person, each individual I interview will say that the hardest part was on the families and what happens afterwards, and taking care of spouses and kids. And we often refer to them as gold star families. And I know you're talking about them in the tier 1 context. So thank you for what you do there. And I know the people listening to this show will greatly appreciate that. I wanted to ask, you had mentioned obviously your time in Africa, sir, not just as an ambassador, but time that you spent there outside of that. International development and aid is a key part of that. Obviously, some of the things we've seen in the news recently of changing USAID's posture is probably foreign to most Americans, honestly. Like if you didn't spend time in the diplomatic community, you might not be aware. I'd be curious from your take, given your time in Africa, what do you see with USAID? How would you encourage Americans to think about USAID as a program, what it gets right, what it gets wrong?
Well, let me open up with a Republican test, which I always applied, and that is my dad was an active Rotarian. And I always pictured myself at a Rotary Club in Cleveland saying, I took $20 from you and we invested it in maternal and child health care in Tanzania because it will make a better world for your grandchildren. Now, if you can't ask that and come up with a satisfactory answer, then you ought to rethink how you're spending the money. But generally speaking, I'm very comfortable with aid programs that have promoted agricultural development, stopping the spread of malaria over and over again. There is a very important role for carefully run development dollars that are expended in the interests of the United States and of the recipient countries.
I would say, Ryan, this is just my perception. The American people need a better explanation of how their money's being spent. They have every right to that. I think we've gotten so big as a government and maybe so isolated here in the Beltway that people just assume that everyone is behind what they're doing with the money. Some of the programs, to my knowledge, what I saw were not really reflective of what the American people's values are. And that was a mistake. But most of them are. And we've always been a very generous nation. The private sector, private communities have always given to help others. During the Russian Civil War, we gave millions of dollars of aid to the people of Russia who are starving from a famine in southern Russia. After the First World War, we had aid programs all over Europe. We had the Marshall Plan, which was probably the most effective aid program you could ever think of in advancing U.S. security. And that's the thing I think Americans need to understand. Many of the programs are designed to advance our national security interests and protect them, keep problems away from the shores of this country. But I do think we as a country, we as a government need to do a much better job explaining to Americans, educating them on why their tax dollars are being used for that. All the Americans I know, they're great people and they want to help other people. They just want to make sure that the money's not being wasted, and they want to make sure that the money's not being siphoned off by some corrupt official somewhere. And I have every right to ask that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And ambassadors don't do enough taking the time to explain to American citizens where their money is going and why it's important. It's my old Rotary test. I can picture folks in Cleveland looking at me and saying, we don't have enough money for X. And you're taking money out of my pocket.
Yeah.
And they have every right to ask that. And when you don't answer it, you get what's happened today, and that is a sweeping effort to rebuild U.S. development assistance.
That's part of the country team dynamic. I was curious, how much sway does the ambassador have in directing that aid or in adjusting it on the ground?
Sometimes when, for example, one of my favorites was the president of Tanzania was opposed to an aid program that we were sponsoring with the Canadians. That was dry land agriculture, at which they are good. It's heavily mechanized, if you will. So President Nyerere said, now, Ambassador Miller, let's see. You want me to do dry land agriculture with big equipment because that's the modern way to farm. And he said, I have no foreign exchange, so I can't buy equipment. And I have no money for fuel, so I couldn't run the equipment if I bought it. And I have people that need employment. Oh, so let's see. You're going to put people out of work modernizing agriculture. That was really dumb. Now, we solved that by working with a guy named Bob Rodale, who's in organic farming, was in organic farming here. And my dear wife got me to Bob Rodale's organic farming. We bought a gazillion books on organic farming, got them to Julius Nyerere, and then the magic sauce was put in, and that is the Americans endorsed organic farming. Now, as Julius Nyerere said, that's what the Maasai have been doing forever. They pick up animal dung, they put it inside an enclosure at night. Oh,
yeah, but now it's at Whole Foods. So
yeah, and now it's at Whole Foods, and it costs you $1 an egg.
I was going to say we can add a $2 markup.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're a good ambassador, you try to keep your aid program within 10 points of either side on a true heading, unless things are really bad. And so between my wife and Julius Nyerere, we improved the aid program.
High five.
That's a great one. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll let you get out of here. Sir, you just have mentioned in this short conversation, being in the car with the national security advisor, being on the ground in Vietnam with other very important people, meeting with heads of state. As you look back on your career, is there a particular meeting that you had that still stands out, a very memorable engagement, encounter with a world leader or just a very important person that you could not have predicted, but really you remember fondly?
Nelson Mandela, by far the most remarkable human being I've ever met. We were in Windhoek. Secretary Baker was meeting with Mr. Mandela for the first time after his release. And the talks went okay, but we were going to go on to South Africa. And the anti-apartheid activities in the States. And Mr. Mandela said, I wish you wouldn't go to South Africa till apartheid has ended. So after their meeting, we went out into a little garden area, and there was a lot of press there. And Secretary Baker was getting a lot of tough questions about, Mr. Mandela doesn't want you to go to South Africa. Why are you doing this? And when you're the bag carrier, you're sitting there holding two bags and saying, "Oh, darn." Those are bad questions. When I suddenly felt some pressure on my back and I turned around and there's Mr. Mandela. And he's walking up to Secretary Baker and he puts his arm around him and he said, "You've got it wrong. This is my new friend, Jim Baker, and we're going to be fine." I mean, you could have pushed me over with.
Wow.
Mr. Mandela was an astounding human being. I was the note taker in the Oval Office then too, and to watch him work, he was great. A great, great man.
Amazing. Sir, thank you for this short discussion. This is fantastic. Glenn, thank you for making this happen. Any last words to listeners right now, Glenn or Ambassador Miller?
I just want to wish your listeners a great weekend.
Yeah.
Yes.
God bless America.
Yes. May they have something to drink while they're watching this. It'll go down better.
Including fruit juice.
Yeah. Fruit juice.
Fruit juice. Prune juice.
Yes. Remember, Kappas only drinks lemonade.
Prune juice.
Thanks, gentlemen. Just a quick word from our sponsor, Delete Me. Having spent many years in the security space, I'm very aware of how much personal info is out there and what determined people can do with it, from identity theft to phishing, harassment, doxing, unwanted spam calls, and more. I've been doxed in the past, and it's something I do not want to experience again. That's why I personally choose Delete Me. Delete Me is a subscription service that removes your personal info from hundreds of data brokers. Delete Me sends you regular, personalized privacy reports showing what info they found, where they found it, and what they removed. Delete Me isn't just a one-time service. Delete Me is always working for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you don't want on the internet. I got my most recent report earlier this month, and it reviewed over 1,800 listings. To put it simply, Delete Me does all the hard work of wiping your and your family's personal information from data broker websites. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan by texting COMBAT to 64000. Text COMBAT to 64,000. That's COMBAT to 64000. Disclaimer, message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.